So what doing a rewrite really means, it means understanding, primarily for me nowadays, it means understanding all of the business logic involved in that application, and having that well documented before you even touch code.
ColdFusion Alive, the podcast for the ColdFusion community. Discover practices, tools, techniques, tips and trends for modern ColdFusion development. Brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Here is your host, the founder of TerraTech, Michaela Light.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here with Denny, and Springle is his last name. You may have heard of him. He used to be a very regular speaker, and he's just back on the conference circuit for ColdFusion. We're going to be talking about refactoring versus rewriting, which is incredibly important because I have seen a lot of ColdFusion developers and CIOs shoot themselves in the foot in this, and we'll reveal which of the two options is more dangerous. I guess there's a third unwritten option, which is do absolutely nothing with your legacy app, which is another dangerous option. So welcome, Denny. Those of you who don't know him, he's a polyglot developer. That sounds quite sexy, actually. But I guess that means you program in a bunch of different languages as well as ColdFusion.
Absolutely.
And you've been doing ColdFusion and Java for over 2 decades. So basically since ColdFusion came out, more or less. And he's highly respected, helps people out at conferences and in the different groups and forums, and great guy to know. So, and he likes to focus on application engineering using modern best practices. So welcome, Denny. Yeah. So, for a lot of people listening have some legacy ColdFusion app, and they may be thinking of rewriting it or refactoring it, or maybe they're not thinking about it at all and they're just going to leave it alone.
Right.
So there are 3 typical options there. And why is this such an important topic, this year?
I think that for me personally, I think that the decision to refactor or rewrite needs to be considered carefully, and need to know what all the risks and rewards are for each method, and understanding the different ways of approaching those. I think that is an important distinction to make between the two approaches to getting what you want out of your application.
So, that makes sense. I mean, people may have they may think they're supposed to do it a certain way, but they haven't thought through what are the possible risks and rewards for each method. What about the unspoken stepchild if you just leave your legacy app in the corner and don't feed it any new improvements? Rewrite
that will ultimately lead to it being hacked 9 times out of 10.
Yes, unfortunately.
If you leave an app alone for too long, it will develop flaws that nobody knew were there until years later. So if you don't maintain those things, then you run that risk. You also run the risk of not delivering the tools that you need to whoever your end users are, whether that's internal clients or external clients or what have you. You run the risk of even losing customers by not continuing to improve your application. So there's definitely a lot of risk to leaving it alone as well.
Yeah, I mean, with the pace of technology and business change, doing nothing or standing still is moving backwards.
Absolutely.
So in addition, I just want to dig into that security risk because I've talked to a lot of people whose legacy apps got hacked because, they're on some old version of ColdFusion or they had unsecure code in there. And it's not just a technical headache because now you've got days of cleanup work or you're trying to undo being ransomware or whatever. It's a reputation risk to the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
But now their customers don't trust them. So not a wise course of action. So, and another factor with not doing anything on legacy apps is, to be honest, when I interview ColdFusion developers, not many of them want to work on spaghetti legacy code.
That's true. That kind of leads into why a lot of developers see the spaghetti code and say to their CIO or their manager, "We need to rewrite this," right?
Yeah. They have an allergy to spaghetti,
Right. Well, and I've done it. I've come into companies and been like, no, let's rewrite this. So I've been down the road and made those mistakes, which is why I can say with some certainty that there are pitfalls. But I get it as a developer. You come in and go, I could do this better, right? I understand how this could be done better. But it's a very high level. I don't want to touch this old spaghetti code. Just let me rewrite it, and it'll be great. But you end up missing a lot of the big picture pieces. And either you give a timeline that is too aggressive because you didn't really consider all the factors involved, or which leads to failure, or you just absolutely miss important business intelligence pieces outright that make whatever you produce not what it needs to be an adequate replacement to what you're trying to replace. So there's definitely a lot of risks, but I get the urge. I understand the urge when you come into a company, or you come onto a position, or you bring on a client that has this old legacy style code. I understand the urge to want to rewrite. That's
absolutely. And it's a good urge. It just needs to be channeled correctly. So.
Right. And I've learned to temper that over the years with that understanding of all the pieces involved, and understanding that a rewrite is a large endeavor and not something to be taken lightly. Whereas,
well, we'll dig into that in more detail later. But maybe before we do that, maybe some people listening are not 100% sure what we even mean by the term rewrite or refactor. So
right.
What does refactoring mean to you?
So refactoring is a way of taking and modernizing code that already exists, and bringing it up to speed with generally modern best development practices. So some object orientation, data modeling type of thing, as well as either using a framework or building an application framework yourself that hits all of the major obstacles that a framework will do for you generally, so that you have a unified platform upon which developers can develop. And especially when you get into teams, refactoring is a process that allows you to take a piecemeal approach. And you can do the same thing with rewriting as well, but the refactor gives you a chance to get into the code. It gives you a chance to understand the code. It gives you a chance to improve that code, and bring it along to, like I said, more modern standards, modern practices, so that the code becomes easier to maintain. It becomes, your reusability becomes a factor, performance becomes a factor, security becomes a factor. All these things can transpire at a much slower pace when you're refactoring. And a lot of times refactor can end up with what is essentially a rewrite at the end of the day, right? You can refactor an application to something that is all modern, is all in an MVC framework using object orientation and good data models and all of that stuff. You can end up with that with a refactor process, the same as you can with a rewrite process. The difference for me is refactoring allows you to take that piecemeal approach. It allows you to implement things like feature flags if you want to be able to implement new functionality and turn it on and make sure it works. And if it doesn't, you can turn it off and go back to the old code until you got it to a point where you want it. So there's all these steps that refactoring lets you take in a small step kind of way that a rewrite generally does not. A rewrite generally is, okay, let's sit down and figure out every single thing we need to do and put down a plan, and then let's rewrite it, and then we launch it.
Yeah, it's an incremental set of improvements to the code. And literally refactoring means taking a piece of code and keeping the functionality the same, or sticking it into a object or a function, and but then changing how it internally is coded to follow those best practices, improve security and performance and usability. So then let's just talk about what is a rewrite, because I think most people have an idea, they know what a rewrite is, but what does doing a rewrite really mean?
So what doing a rewrite really means, it means understanding, primarily for me nowadays, it means understanding all of the business logic involved in that application, and having that well documented before you even touch code. If you don't do that, then you're going to fail. I mean, you may not. You may. It's probably, I shouldn't say you will fail. The chances of failure become higher if you don't take into consideration what it is the application should be doing, what business logic processes it should be implementing, and what business intelligence does it use, and what problem was it meant to solve, and how does it do that, and how do you effectively capture all that into an effective rewrite cycle. At one of my clients now, they're rewriting an application into Node, and they've been working on it for 2.5 years, and all the while we're still maintaining their ColdFusion code, right? So, and improving their ColdFusion code, and we've had to take steps even there to do things that will allow that rewrite to ultimately leverage the APIs and the data that we are using in our current application. And 2.5 years into this, and they're still trying to figure out what all the bits and bobs of the business are, right? And what processes still need to be written, and that's why it's taking them so long. And they are committed to doing it, and I believe they will eventually succeed. But again, they didn't come into this with the prior knowledge of what does this application do? What does it need to do? What kind of business intelligence is it handling? And so they're finding out as they go along, right? Yeah. Which requires, engineering a solution, and then, I didn't engineer it right because I didn't understand it. So now I've got to go back and re-engineer that. And it just really takes a long time if you're not well prepared up front, with a deep knowledge of the product that you're trying to replace. And a lot of times that's just not there, right? You come into a client who's, had 30 developers and 20 years working on the same application, and there's nobody left, right? So there's nobody around with any kind of original OG knowledge, right? So, and they bring you on and go, well, we want to rewrite this and add these additional features and things. And you have to, kind of step back and say, okay, well, do you as the client have, the level of knowledge about this application and what it does and what problems it solves, and all that information needs to be kind of decided up front. and known. You need a known quantity to have an end goal. Whereas refactoring is more like you said, you can refactor a single piece of code to improve it, to bring it up to speed with, like I said, modern practices or whatnot. And then that piece is done. Generally, that's not how rewrites go. Rewrites go, okay, I'm going to take the database and I'm going to go off and write all the data models and do all the stuff that I'm going to do. And it may be in an entirely different language, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many companies that have gone from CF to, Node or to .NET or Java even. And there's so little correlation between a lot of the legacy CF style of coding, especially if it's tag based, versus any of the modern languages that, it becomes very difficult, especially for a developer of a language that is not ColdFusion, that has had no ColdFusion experience, for them to go in and understand what that application was doing and then re-implement that functionality in another language.
Yeah, so rewriting, you're changing out some of the technology pieces. You may be changing the programming language. Maybe you're not. Sometimes people rewrite in the same programming language. Maybe they're rewriting in a newer version of it, or they're using modern CFscript and object orientation or whatever. Often they are changing to a new language because it's like flavor of the month that, like the corporation for whatever political reasons. They may also be changing out other components. They might be changing the database, either a version, or they're changing from SQL Server to MySQL. They may be changing the operating system, or they're moving to the cloud. They may be changing, you mentioned frameworks earlier, they may be changing which framework they're using. For example, a lot of legacy ColdFusion apps, if they either have a homegrown framework or they use Fusebox. And Fusebox isn't supported anymore, unfortunately. And, homegrown framework, you're never going to get third-party support for that. So you may be changing it. And I think part of the thing with a rewrite is you're changing so many moving parts. It's sort of like doing, and the app isn't static. It's being used by users every day, maybe 24/7. Maybe it's business critical. It's sort of like doing repairs on an airplane while it's in the air. Yeah. So or you're building a new airplane next to the old airplane, kind of walking out on the wings to kind of investigate how does the old airplane do this particular situation. It's a bit dodgy.
Yeah.
To use an English word, a British English word. It means
proper English.
Yes, proper. There you go. So the analogy I've used with customers sometimes is, your legacy app is a bit like a house where the lights are all turned off in the rooms. It's like a black box. Yeah, the outside of it operates okay, but you don't know what's in each of the rooms and the basement and the attic. And then you come into this legacy code, you're stumbling around, you're banging your shins on a coffee table you didn't know was there. Finally, you find the light switch, turn it on, you understand how that room works, how that piece of code works. And then either you can extract out the business logic for it if you're trying to investigate for a rewrite, or you can rearrange the furniture and modernize things, give it a new coat of paint. And that's more of a refactor. So the rewrite is demolish the house, rebuild another house, possibly with totally different materials. If you're the three pigs, you might choose brick over straw, for example, or whatever your pig building best practices are these days. Whereas with the refactor, you're taking the existing structure. If it's sound, you're saying, okay, well, we just need to do, use some modern wiring in this house, or, fix up the plumbing, get rid of these lead pipes, and stick in modern plumbing. So tell us about, you mentioned briefly some of it seems like you have when you were younger, you had a bias towards rewriting, and now you're, slightly older. You must be in your late 20s by now, Denny.
Yeah. Late 20s times 3 almost.
Yes.
Yeah, and in my early years, I was definitely the guy that
I
would
think
come
you mean
in.
times 2 for listeners.
Yeah, yeah.
You,
Uh, in my early years, I was definitely the rewrite guy. Um,
rewrite kid, we should say.
rewrite
Like,
kid,
right,
rewrite
yeah.
kid. That was my limited understanding of things at the time. Um, led me to believe that I was smarter than the other guys in the room and could, produce something um, that was better than whatever was there and could do it in, an adequate time frame. And I've underestimated every time I've tried to do a rewrite, the amount of time it was going to take. I've underestimated the amount of time it would take just to understand the actual business logic of the application. Never mind the actual coding pieces. In fact, I distinctly remember starting with a company and they asked me to look at the code and they were like, what do you think? And I was like, we should rewrite this. And the boss was like, yeah. How long do you think that'll take? And I had to be in my 20s. I was like, I don't know, 2 weeks. And, 2 weeks came and went and the boss is like, all right, so, where's my rewrite? And I was like, I was wrong. So I learned through trial and error that, the risks of just going into a rewrite, for the sake of going into a rewrite is probably not the best approach.
One risk is that the project goes over budget.
Definitely.
I think most software developers and
yeah.
CIOs have seen projects that went over budget.
Yeah. Budgets are definitely the first thing to go.
Yeah. But there is also a risk of total project failure. I've talked with a number of CIOs who either their predecessors decided to do a rewrite of a ColdFusion app or they did. And, after spending millions of dollars and years of time, it just never launched. It just never was successfully completed. It wasn't just that it went over budget. It's like they never did figure out the right business logic. The users never liked the new rewritten version of the app.
Yep.
For various reasons, because either they missed some business logic or because there was no focus on change management. Users hate change, as do most humans. And so there was no project time put into education or, championing the new system and why it was better. This even happens in SaaS apps. I was talking to someone yesterday. They're using some SaaS to run most of their business, and the SaaS decided to do a rewrite. Well, they didn't bother to actually talk to their users, like the person I was talking to, and the new version is like sucky and it's like takes 3 times longer to do anything than it did before because it was done right.
Right. Well, it was done in the way the user was accustomed to, and now it's not.
It could be that, or it could be that it's a business reason they do it a certain way.
That's true too.
And in the ideal rewrite developer mind, that wasn't a possibility.
Yeah.
So
that is true.
Yeah. So and also another way projects fail, they just never get out of debugging. I've seen that happen where a project. Ideally, when you're writing a new project, the bugs, once you've got all the features done, the number of bugs decrease, right? And eventually, you may not get to 0 bugs, but you hope to get to very few bugs.
Yeah.
And sometimes, for various reasons, the number of bugs doesn't go down. Yeah. I do remember on one big project many years ago, we had one developer on it. He seemed to have a negative bug entropy. He'd fix one bug and create 1.5 new bugs.
Right.
We took him off the project. People write different quality of code.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I spent over 2 decades mentoring other developers. So are trying. I've come to the conclusion that there are people who are willing to learn and people who are not. And the ones that are willing to learn are the ones that I take the time to mentor, and the ones that aren't, I make suggestions and they can take them or leave them. But I'm not going to invest a lot of time in them.
Yeah. Another issue is, sometimes, I'm sure this doesn't apply to anyone in the current room or listening to this, but sometimes people are so excited by the new data model and the new, coding features in Node or .NET or whatever, that they forget about the user interface and that there are actual users who have to use this. Sometimes, while a rewrite may look bright and shiny, it may have sharp places that are hard to use or just aren't fun to use. So Microsoft's team especially good at producing programs at this stage.
Yeah.
They're technically correct in how they function, but they're kind of clunky.
Yeah.
And so it's quite hard to make, I guess this compares to, I'm not a fan of Apple products, but some people rave about them. And one of the things they rave about is the ease of use design. And the same thing applies to software. You've got to take that into account as well. And although the legacy code may be a little old looking, at least people are used to it, and the sharp edges are being rounded off over time.
Yeah,
so
I've seen lipstick on a pig as well.
Oh,
so.
Yes. Well, lipstick on a bad rewrite is even worse. So,
yep.
So
this podcast is brought to you by TerraTech, the ColdFusion experts. Develop, secure, optimize. Get detailed show notes on today's episode and your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TerraTech.com. And now back to today's show.
What other things have you seen in the rewrite disasters or risks or successes? Must have been some rewrite successes, right?
Yeah. I've had of the several I've tried in my career, I have had one really successful rewrite.
Out of how many?
I'd say 1 out of 5.
That's not good odds. That's only slightly better than playing Russian roulette, Denny.
Yeah. So, I think, and I stress this, I keep stressing this. I think that knowing the business intelligence has been a primary reason for, or not knowing the business intelligence of the existing application has been a primary reason for why I've seen rewrites fail in my career. That I've tried to approach myself personally, with or without teams. And I think that missing those pieces, and like you said, making changes to user interfaces, even the slightest change. I mean, we see this with Microsoft, right? From Windows 10 to Windows 11, they took away the right click, giving you everything, to right click, giving you a more options option, right? Which everyone hated and immediately sought to reverse, right? So, even small changes that someone somewhere thinks is a quality of life improvement can be disastrous for the actual people using the application. So, as far as disasters, the obvious one is, going to a point where there is no budget left, right? So you've gone over budget to the point where there's no money left to do this. I have a client right now that wanted to rewrite. He's, running out of money for his application, and, he was like, I should just scrap all this and start over. And it was like, no, don't do that, because you'll be out of money before you ever get it done. Right. You've gone from having a budget of $300,000 this year to having, a budget of $100,000 the next year. you're not going to pull off a rewrite in $100,000, right? Not of something that you've already spent 300 grand on. So it's those kind of decisions that have to be made. And those are the kind of risks, you get to a point where you think, oh, we'll get this done in 6 months, and 6 months comes and goes and you're not half done. And then you go, okay, well, we can afford to go another 6 months. It should be done by then. And then 6 months comes and goes and you're still, you're 2/3 done maybe. And you haven't done user acceptance testing or any of that kind of stuff yet. So there's all these pitfalls. And the one that I know harping back on is just not knowing what the application does, not encapsulating all the same business logic in the new application that was in the old application. Whether that's, a user experience thing, or whether it's an actual, business need that is not being met when you do the rewrite. Because it's easy to miss, right? You think, okay, this screen does this. Okay, I make it go do that, but you missed all the underlying logic of what made that screen, right? Mm-hmm. What calculations are happening, all these things. You go off and do ad hoc things, and you especially if you don't go back and look at the code, and that's where refactoring is a handier tool, because you're in the code. You get to understand and look at and appreciate what the code is doing. It may be doing a poor job of it, and you may refactor it to a point where it's no longer recognizable as the original code, but you've captured all that business logic. You've not gone off and just written something willy-nilly thinking that's what it should do and not knowing what it actually did do. So I think that's a big one that I've run into.
Yeah, I mean, I would say only consider doing a rewrite if either the business logic is simple or it's very well documented.
Yeah.
Or possibly the business. I guess another reasoning might be if the business has been merged, or something's really radically changed, then
sure,
it may be easier to start fresh. But
and I've seen that happen too. I've seen companies merge together where one's company is using PHP and the other's using ColdFusion, and ultimately the PHP guys go, well, we can rewrite all this that you're already doing in ColdFusion, and then they go off and try and do it, right? But none of the ColdFusion guys are left because they got rid of all those guys because they're going to rewrite it in PHP, so they don't need us anymore. And a couple years later, they might call us back up and go, hey, that rewrite we were doing, but it didn't work.
Yeah, didn't work. So, yes, that's very common, unfortunately. I mean, the other thing you mentioned, user acceptance testing. I would add having real users, beta testers, if possible. Early in the process, give feedback. And then I think it helps to have a plan for a really long shakedown period after you release the new rewrite. If you're going to go the rewrite route, you've got to allow months for user feedback and rapidly fix the issues in business logic that you missed, or the user experience that you missed, so you can get them on board. You can't just we're out of budget and we're not going to fix it until next year,
right?
Because then people are going to not embrace the app. And yes, if it's an internal app, you can kind of force them to do it, just like some organizations are still forcing people to use Microsoft IE browser.
Right.
We don't want to recode the front end.
We wrote this in 1992, and we're not doing anything with it. So use IE.
Use IE, yes. And if it's possible in your business, a lot of SaaS owners I know do this. They don't have 100% of the users on the new version, right? They use feature flags or other technology. Just roll out to 10% of the users and see, hey, is it working okay? They look at the metrics on the app. Great thing about web apps, you can tell where people are getting stuck. You can use one of those heat map tools like Hotjar or whatever. You can see where people are what do they call it? Rage clicking, where they're like the mouse and nothing's happening. You can detect that. You can actually watch entire recordings of what they were doing and where they got confused. Or you can sit down over someone's shoulder while they use your app.
Yep.
That's typically user experience type activity.
Yep.
So, planning for that is a good idea. But if it's anything to do with, you have customers or a public, if you F up your rewrite, they're going to bail.
Yep.
Unless you're the US government where you're not allowed to have a competitor.
Right.
I think we should actually change. I think we should have several different governments that you could pick for the DMV.
There you go.
License.
Right.
Like, I want to go to DMV version A today. Yeah. Maybe they'd get more. Nothing against people who are working at the DMV.
No, not at all.
A little competition makes things work better.
A lot of times.
Yeah. So let's talk about your current. You've now moved away from rewriting, and you've moved towards refactoring. And I think typically you're keeping the app running during the refactor. Is that true for you? I mean,
yes, absolutely.
You do a little bit of refactoring. You make sure it's great. You refactor one area or one module or one feature or one thing under the hood. And then you test it and roll it out, and you make sure it's still all working okay before you and fix any issues, any bugs, any user interface issues.
Yep.
Before you move on to the next thing. And this works really well in an agile type environment. I don't know if you're agile kind of.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sprints fit very well with that. With a refactor.
So a sprint for people who haven't ever done one, you have a period of time, maybe it's 2 weeks, possibly a month. You don't really want to make it much longer than that. It gets out of control. And then you say, look, we're going to implement so many new features in a sprint, I don't know, 2 new features or 4 or whatever the number is based on the capacity of the team and the digestibility of the old business logic. And then you focus on just those features for that. And the idea is to test them, deliver them, and be done by the end of the sprint. And then you get with the business users like, well, what's your priority? Because the features picked for that sprint are not just coming out of some whiz kid, the rewrite kid's rear end, right? The business users are like, well, this is what's most important for us in the next 2 weeks. We'd really like to get this report improved, or we need this feature changing, or whatever.
Yep.
Or, our technical partner's API has changed and this bit stopped working and we need it fixed up to work with their new API or whatever. So
our API provider got bought by a bigger company and they've rechanged everything. And so,
that can happen.
Yep.
So the idea being that the app is constantly in use, you're improving different parts of it. But when you finish that 2 weeks, that part is used. So you don't get in a situation. One of the problems with a rewrite as opposed to a refactor is you may go months before anything gets tested. Because there's not enough working pieces in the rewrite at the beginning to be even using it. That's part of the issue.
It's true.
All right, you may chunk it up into agile sprints if that's what your cup of tea is. What are tell us what else you do in your refactor process?
So these days, I typically, the first thing I try and do is look at reusability. And that typically comes down to making sure that there's a data model, whether that's, an object-oriented data model or an ORM data model or however you want to put it together. But a central set of services or CFCs that handle the actual logic of persisting that data and getting that data out, so that you don't have a query that does the same thing in 12 different places in the code, right? You're always using a single CFC service that has that query in it, and you just call it in one place. If things ever change, you have to change it in that one place, or maybe 2 if you're using DAOs and services. maybe 3 if you're using, beans and DOs and services. There's 3 places to change something, versus 12 or 24. Or, I've seen applications that have queries in, hundreds of places that have to be changed when something changes in the table. So I like to focus primarily at the outset on building a data model that encapsulates not only the data itself, but the business logic that acts upon that data. And then,
so just before we move on from that, reusability is nice for having one piece of code in one place and not where the problem comes from is some people, none of us in the room probably do this, but there was some copying and pasting of code that occurred instead of taking the time to be like, oh, this code's pretty much exactly the same, or it's 99% the same with a different parameter, and let's write a function or stick a parameter into the SQL query or whatever you're going to achieve here.
Yep.
And so you're saying, hey, let's identify that, let's commonize it so that when we're making changes, we can do it in one place instead of 100 places.
Yep. And it makes the code a lot more maintainable over time.
Exactly. And that was the point I was going to make. It reduces the time for future maintenance. So that's a great improvement you do in your process. And I'd add one more thing in. Sometimes there's not any copies of code around. There's actual whole chunks of code that are just never run.
It's true.
It's incredibly, I call it deadwood code because it's dead. And it's like branches of a tree that died.
Right. They've written a new routine to replace it, but never went back and cleaned it out.
Yeah, they may have done that, or maybe the business case changed. And that whole feature is not used anymore.
Yep.
Another thing, I won't name the company or the programmer here, but the programmer had a habit of they made a copy of a whole folder of stuff, and it was feature 2 or feature 3 or copy of this. And that sounds fair enough. You might be able to guess which one wasn't being used, but then they would use random CF files out of each folder to kind of mix it up and make it more fun for anyone following them.
Or not following.
Yeah, that program was terminated with extreme prejudice, to use the phrase out of whatever that movie was, Apocalypse Now. It was Code Apocalypse Now.
Right.
They just lost their job. And we've been able to refactor and clean up most of their messes over time. So, but it is very common to find whole folders or sections of code that are not used. And the same in the database. Often in a database, there are whole tables that someone thought were a good idea, or it's just like a test copy or a backup copy, and even indexes. Not all indexes are equal, unfortunately.
That's true.
And sometimes they were put on and no one thought to check, are they still useful?
Yeah.
So, anyway, I'll get off my deadwood soapbox.
No, that's good. It's absolutely true. And especially I found in databases, a lot of times I find things that just aren't used anymore.
I will add one thing to this. Often there's data to be archived. The app's been running for 20 years. It doesn't really need for reporting purposes to go back more than a year or two.
Yeah.
And yet it's got millions of rows of data and it's kind of plugging it up. Or there's, I don't know, I'm shocked, but sometimes there's bad data, or it's not validated, or the primary key is dorked up, or that's another potential issue that we come across.
Yep. For sure.
So you've looked into the reusability, and you've put down to common stuff, got rid of the unused stuff. What was the next step in your refactoring?
And these days, I typically try to move to an MVC framework, either ColdBox or Framework One. I was a Framework One fanboy for a really long time, and didn't really like ColdBox. Over the past several years, I've gotten to know ColdBox and like ColdBox more. And I think that both frameworks still have a use and a purpose in the community, and there's different reasons to use different the different ones. I think framework one is very lightweight and allows you to kind of get the MVC without a lot of the bells and whistles, whereas ColdBox has all the bells and whistles as well as a whole ecosystem of additional products that work together.
To be fair, you're talking about the box products that the Altus guy made.
Yeah.
To be fair, a lot of those box other products, they work great with ColdBox, but they can work with your.
They're all standalone as well.
Absolutely. Like Wirebox is an example of that.
Wirebox, Cashbox, Testbox, those are all.
Yeah, they work great with ColdBox, but they work fine with your refactoring app either way. I'll just mention for people listening, CF Wheels is the other common framework. They all have roughly 25-30% of the market. Apart from the people who have a custom homegrown framework or are still using Fusebox. So
Fusebox or Model Glue or Mach 2.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Which they were all great frameworks in their time. They were innovative, but they're just not being maintained.
Yeah.
And that's the issue here. That if you go with Framework One, ColdBox, or CF Wheels, they all have a community. They're all open source. They all have a community of developers maintaining them and improving them. And if there's a problem, you have other people to turn to.
Yep.
And it's easier to hire people who might have used them or something similar.
Yep.
Whereas if you stick with the homebrew one, it may be just fine, but you have to now train people on, well, here's how our framework works. There's no external documentation on it. So.
Yep. That's true.
And just step back a bit. Why is we talked earlier, we touched on this organizes your code, I believe, but maybe we should just dig a bit better into why do you add a framework?
So it's partly because of code organization, right? So the MVC frameworks that we have now are primarily convention over configuration. So for those that don't know, like back in the Fusebox and Mach 2 days, you had to configure pretty much everything. And the idea of convention over configuration is as long as your files are in this folder, then they'll be picked up by this process and used. So I think that the code organization that MVC brings is a good part of it. I think the separation of concerns that MVC brings is an important piece as well. I think that the ability to separate your views from your control logic, from your service logic is highly conducive to not only just having reusability of the code, but also in having a good organizational structure that all developers that are in your organization can learn to follow, right? One of the key things I've learned over the years when I'm working in teams is to try and get as many of the team members on the same page as possible in terms of, the code style and technique, so that, any developer can pick up any other developer's code and have a rough idea of how it was being put together and what, organizational rules are being used. And frameworks allow that to happen because, as you said, they may come from another company and have already used it, right? They may already have experience with it. And that makes it easier to get your developers up to speed and make them, and increase their productivity out of the gate. So I think there's a lot of good reasons to move to a framework. There's a lot of valid reasons not to use a framework as well. But I think from a code organization, maintainability, readability, and frankly, even just performance and functionality, a lot of times you'll get better results out of an MVC framework than you will out of not using one.
I mean, another benefit of sticking all the front end code into Vue parts of the MVC is that if you have people who are UX coders, they're doing CSS or whatever, they can tweak with that code. They're less likely to dork up your SQL queries or ColdFusion logic.
It's true.
So, and the same with the SQL code. If you separate out the SQL into a, part of your model, and some of these frameworks, you do separate the database stuff into separate objects, or whatever. You can have a DBA tweak around with that without too much fear they'll screw up the UX or whatever. So, the other thing I'd say is MVC is not just a ColdFusion thing. This is a software industry-wide thing.
Yep.
Pretty much I'm not aware of any modern programming language that does not have an MVC framework that is popular. PHP does.
Yep.
Python.
Laravel.
Yeah. They all have their own favorite MVC language. I'm sure there are languages out there that don't, but
probably Basic.
Basic. They or Lisp probably.
Lisp.
Lisp just has lots of parentheses.
Pretty much.
But any web development language that's being used in a modern way. I mean, Perl doesn't, right?
Probably.
As far as I know. I guess you could have it.
I haven't touched Perl since 90 something. So,
well, probably wise. Otherwise, we'd have to disinfect you.
Right.
No insult meant to Perl programmers in the audience, but it is a little bit of a cryptic language. It's a bit like RPG. If you ever program that on mainframe days gone by. For those who don't know what RPG is, just to say that the column you put the stuff in is critical, and if you get it in the wrong column, it doesn't run. Right.
Yep.
So bit of a headache, and also the keywords or whatever you call them in the language were kind of cryptic too.
Yeah.
I try and stay away from that. Anyway, so go use a modern, move to a modern framework, and basically that means taking the existing code and slowly over time you're moving it into those different three bits of code. So what else do you do? Go ahead.
And the primary way that I do that, which is, bringing things over these days, is to actually just build a REST API.
Mm-hmm.
It has a lot of benefits in addition to the fact that you're refactoring. It has long-term benefits for the organization. You can change front-end frameworks anytime you want, right? So when the next great thing comes along that the kid you just hired out of college wants to do to improve your UX, he can go off and do that and not have to worry about touching any code that touches any of the back end, right? He's just working off the API, or she. And so there's,
I think APIs are feminine they're like ships. APIs are she's by default. Oh, you meant the programmer?
Or that too.
Absolutely, many programmers are she's.
Absolutely.
Oh, probably non-binary programmers out there as well.
I would think so.
Hexadecimal instead of binary.
I would think there was quite a few at Twitter at one point.
So the reason for you putting a REST, and for people who don't know, REST is just a standard for APIs versus SOAP. So it's just a way of doing your APIs. And do not worry, because ColdFusion by default, when you do an object, you can change one parameter on the object and it'll be pumping out an API. It's not hard to do.
Yeah.
So don't worry for those listening at home who haven't, I've never done a REST API or consumed one. ColdFusion, as in many things, makes it incredibly easy to use this advanced piece of technology.
And to your point, REST is another pattern, right? So just as MVC is a pattern, REST is a pattern that you use to organize your application in a way that makes consumption by other applications easier, right? Or other technologies. So it replaced, I won't say it replaced SOAP, because I still interface with a bunch of SOAP stuff these days still, and old XML stuff. But for the most part, REST is replacing that old school RPC style application calls with something that is more data centric and works in a standardized format, which is JSON. So there's just a lot of advantages to going to a REST-based API.
Absolutely, it's the modern way to do them.
Yeah.
And I think the word we didn't say earlier about REST API, you're encapsulating the code.
Yes.
Right. With any API type architecture, it's a bit of a black box. You send it the parameters, it sends back the results. And so it's less likely to be, if you have a problem in one part of the code, it can't mess up this part of the code and vice versa. So that's the benefit, or one of the benefits here.
And typically you're encapsulating business logic, not just the data model itself, right? So the encapsulation takes into account all those things that your business views and things like that you wouldn't necessarily think about if you're just looking at it from a data model perspective. I've seen a lot of people that build APIs that are basically just, glorified CRUD interfaces to their database.
Yum.
Right.
CRUD.
Right. And so, I
think they got that acronym wrong. I mean, it should have been spelled CRAP.
Yeah.
There is a place for CRUD, but yeah.
So, and
now, if you encapsulate this, does it let you switch out your front end? For example, or
yeah, I mean, absolutely. It there's a lot of benefits to the API, especially in today's landscape. I haven't met a client today that doesn't want a mobile app, right? And so having an API is almost essential to building a mobile app. An API.
And the reason is because you only want to send as few bytes as you can between the backend server and the mobile thing, because the bandwidth may be sucky on that mobile phone.
That's correct.
If you're not living in Southeast Asia, where the mobile speed is faster than the broadband speed in the United States,
right? Or you're not on a line that drops every 20 minutes. Like mine tends to do sometimes. So yes, the advantage, one of the advantages of building an API is that you can then branch out into other technologies such as mobile. You can change front end technologies on a whim. Almost all front end technologies are designed for an API, right? I mean, their way of getting data presented to the end user is expecting to use some kind of AJAX call of some sort, right? And 9 times out of 10, that's going to be an API layer. And these days, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a REST API layer. So, so there's that.
So if folks listening have never consumed a REST API, there are many reasons you should learn how to do this, because there's all these third-party APIs that you could be consuming, and then you could be making your own with the addition of one parameter to your CFCs.
Yep. And then
just like the MVC stuff, every other modern programming language and ecosystem, guess what? They use REST APIs, guys.
Yep.
Get on the REST API bus, so to speak.
Absolutely. And that's another thing, right? It's all of these things are applicable outside of ColdFusion, right? So if you can't get a ColdFusion job, but MVC, REST, how to create data models. I mean, these things are patterns that are used throughout the industry in every language. So you can very easily transform over to a .NET developer if you want to, or a Java developer, or a Ruby on Rails, or whatever you want, because all of these technologies support the same core concepts, and a lot of the vast majority of new applications being written are following these patterns. So it really opens up a sea of opportunities, even in the job market. Once you know the underlying principles, at that point, it's just a matter of syntax, right? So you may need to learn.
This is because you're a polyglot programmer, Denny.
Well,
I wasn't like,
always.
well, I know 6 languages already.
Right.
Learning the 7th one, it's just a matter of different symbols and syntax.
It is, and
some people listening may only know 1 language, and then
that's true.
Learning yourself. I found the 2nd language I learned was, a little harder. By the time I got to the 3rd language, you're absolutely correct. The concepts are generally the same. Occasionally, languages do stuff in really wacko ways, but
true.
Like 4th comes to mind.
Yeah.
Both of those are a bit. I mean, they're fun and whatever, but
yeah.
So, and every language has its own little flavor. But I'd say all the modern web programming languages are more or less, functionally equivalent at some Turing machine level, whatever the right way to evaluate this is.
Right.
Now, you mentioned REST APIs, and when I've been to Into the Box or CF Summit, a lot of people rave about microservices using REST APIs, but I think you have a bit of a different view on those.
Yeah. So I've been down the microservice route, and the problem with microservices that I found is that they become clunky and numerous. Right. So, and that may have been a simple problem of breaking those down too small. But I've seen that over engineering happen a lot, where, they take something and they make it tiny and, all right, we're going to get better performance out of this because it's only doing this. And that's not necessarily always true. Even Amazon has backed out of the whole microservice business, and decided to go back to writing monolithic applications because they ran into the same kind of issues, right? We've got 500,000 microservices powering this application, and nobody knows all 500,000 of them, and nobody knows how they all work together. And so it becomes, on paper, microservices sound really good, but in practice, they just become unwieldy really quickly, I think. And
so for people who don't know what a microservice is, it's basically you've encapsulated and made a separate server that's providing this API to other little baby servers, maybe they're in Docker containers, typically, that consume that microservice. So
yeah.
It's no different than having the APIs all in one server, except that if one API is being called 1,000 times a second and the other one only 3 times a second, the theory would be that you provide more servlerlets for the one that's called a lot.
Yeah,
I mean that's the proposed advantage partly. I think. I'm sure there are other advantages. I should get a microservice fanatic on to talk about.
You should. And there are some valid points there where, especially having containerized versions where you can ramp up 1,000 containers in, a matter of a few seconds, to meet whatever demand is happening at that moment. So there's some advantage to that. But there's also the advantage. That advantage also exists by, having, tall servers that are running optimized code as well, right? So you can get the same performance, you can get the same ability to ramp up. It's just
what is a tall server? Did I hear that correctly? TALL tool.
So a tall server, lots of RAM and CPU and basically as much resources as you can stick in one box. They call that a tall server in the industry. And
are the other servers called height challenge servers?
Yeah, the one user are the shorties. Yeah, so it's I don't know if they call them short servers or not, to be honest with you. I just know that when discussing concurrency and DevOps kind of things, that a lot of the DevOps guys refer to these very large, very robust servers as tall servers. Because they have stacked as much RAM and CPU power and I/O as they can into one server. And that's the horizontal scaling piece, and then the vertical scaling is obviously having multiple of those horizontally scaled servers.
I think I'm going to add a link to this case study that Amazon, and just to be clear to people listening, it was Amazon Prime, not the whole of Amazon, that made this move. They they had something that was very microservice focused, and they moved to a more monolithic type architecture. And I think the other point to give here is that if you're using Adobe ColdFusion, I mean, the new Adobe ColdFusion 2023, hopefully 2024 coming next year, they do have like a meter-based pricing. So you can have, a bunch of little servers. You just pay by the hour you use them. But previously, that licensing didn't exist. And then on the tool servers, the licensing that Adobe provides versus Lucy is a little nutso. I think it was written back in the year 2000 when a server with 2 CPU corelets or whatever they're called, cores, on it was unusual. And now, how many cores do servers have on the tool end of things? It's like 32, or maybe is it 64? I haven't kept up with
64.
64 now. So, and so the Adobe licensing doesn't really translate too well to that. I mean, you can do the math on it. It's just a bit nutso. So, and often when you have a virtual private server, you don't even know what the server underneath is. So, I guess if you're going through an ISP, that's not your headache. It's the ISP's private headache together with Adobe. They give them.
From what I've been hearing, sometimes that can be your problem too.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're using an open source ColdFusion engine like Lucy, that whole issue that isn't an issue. There is no licensing cost issue. But I think that may be another factor that people need to take into account when they're looking at a microservice architecture.
That's true.
What's the cost and legal headache? And then forget the ColdFusion licensing part. If you have hundreds of little servers running, just your AWS bill is going to be a little big.
Yep.
You may need to take a mortgage out to be able to afford paying Amazon. So,
well, now we've got the Google Cloud too. So,
Google Cloud, there's lots of clouds out there.
Yeah.
I mean, I've even used DigitalOcean. They're like 25% of the cost of AWS, and they have most of the features I want for a small thing.
Yep.
If it's a hobby site or whatever. So I probably shouldn't have said that in public.
I almost called out HostTech by name, but I decided not to. Oh, wait.
Well, they've had some problems. We all go through
growing pains
in our lives, growing pains or whatever the thing is. So, I interviewed the folks from XByte, who somewhat Ryan Chum used to be at HostTech and he's now at XByte. So, I'll put that episode in the show notes for this one, which folks can find on the TerraTech site.
Sounds good.
Anything else you want to say about refactoring versus rewriting before we get to our end of show questions?
No, not that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, I think we covered most of the major topics.
All right. Well, I will recap it for people. The answer is refactor.
Absolutely.
Don't rewrite unless you're 110% sure that you've got the business logic wrapped up and there's other reasons why a rewrite is better. But you're taking a lot higher risk doing a rewrite. You have enough risks in any software development activity, so you're really multiplying up risk, and you can achieve the same end results having easy to maintain modern code by doing a refactor. Probably have your business users be happier along the way. So that's the message from our sponsor, rewriting. No, everyone can do rewrites. Refactors, I mean.
Yeah.
We do a lot of refactoring when we modernize apps. So let me ask you, why in this year, ColdFusion's been out for quite a few years.
Only one or two.
Are you proud of it? Huh?
Only one or two.
Only one or two. Yeah, one or two
decades.
1 or 2 digits in hexadecimal. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I started looking at writing my age in hexadecimal because it looks so why are you proud to use ColdFusion, Denny?
I stumbled upon ColdFusion. It was on a disc sitting in a CD sitting in a shelf back in the 90s. In a company I was working for, we were a Java shop writing a Java application. I for some reason picked that disc up and stuck it in my computer and started reading documentation, and I was like, oh, well, there's all these tools we need internally for this company that I can write in this. And that's how I got my start. I was actually a systems administrator back then. I wasn't even officially a programmer, even though I'd been doing programming most of my adult life. So, I think that today I'm proud to use ColdFusion because I have made a significant impact on several businesses in utilizing ColdFusion over other languages. And I have, I do use other languages. Java is probably my second favorite next to ColdFusion. And the reason for that is simple, because I can drop into Java even inside of ColdFusion and get things done a lot quicker. But I think that ColdFusion is something that has been around and has stood up against every other language that's been thrown at it. There are features and functionalities that, Lucy primarily, but Adobe followed, that they implemented into the language. There was a big focus over the last several years on actually improving the language, making it more modern, giving it the same kind of capabilities as every other modern language. Things like functional programming. And then on top of that, ColdFusion adds these handy dandy, kind of get out of jail free functionality, right? I mean, to make an HTTP call in Java, you've got to open the connection, and there's 13 steps you got to make before you even make the HTTP call, right? In ColdFusion, you do a CF HTTP and you pass it everything you need, and it goes off inside of Java ultimately and does all those connection things for you. So it just makes coding a lot easier, especially when you're dealing with web. I think that the capabilities of ColdFusion outweigh any of its drawbacks. There are some that exist, but I think that the rapid application development pieces of it are really still appealing to me.
Absolutely. Very quick to coding.
Yeah. I mean, I can write an application in ColdFusion probably these days. I probably say twice as fast as I can in Java still. And I've done Java for 20 years too. So it's just a matter of, again, there's so many convenience functions in ColdFusion that eliminate those 13 other steps you have to take. And I think that ColdFusion has only grown. I think the community has only gotten it better over the last decade. Unfortunately,
that's because you did a lot of internal personal growth, Denny. with other people improving themselves and being more kind and loving.
I have tried to teach others along the way. But I stood on the shoulders of giants. I mean, I had a lot of mentors along the way too, right? And a lot of those guys are gone now, either onto other languages or literally gone. But you know, I have tried to take what I've learned, not just in terms of the actual technology, but in terms of spreading that knowledge from my mentors, and try to bring that to the rest of the community as much as possible. Because I think it's important that
absolutely got to, pass it on, share it. And to be honest, just from a selfish point of view, you teaching other people helps you really understand what it is even deeper. So
I've had people ask me to do presentations on things that I had no worldly concept of, right? And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I got to go learn this, which, as you say, has made me a better developer, a more well-rounded developer as far as what my understanding is. And I'm one of those guys.
We should have that for other areas of our life. Like, hey, give us a presentation on a deadlift at the gym,
Right.
And it's like, deadlift? How do you do it? I need to Google
guess I'll figure that out, yeah. My wife does excellent deadlifts at the gym. I can't lift the bar off the ground, but she can do awesome at the gym these days. Very proud of her.
Well, those are great reasons to be proud of ColdFusion. I'll just add in one of my own, which is in the last 5 or 10 years, the ecosystem around ColdFusion, all the tooling, pipelines, the box products. It's just thanks to, Luis Manjano, Altis, and all the other Altis guys.
Yep.
And a lot of people contributing to those open source projects. Really, I think the ecosystem is actually better in ColdFusion than Node, or certainly than PHP. I understand it's a bit biased, but you just look at what tools are available. We've got the best of breed ecosystem tools with ColdFusion now.
We do.
Because we shamelessly will copy ideas from things we see in other languages, and they copy stuff.
And that's great. And that's how, again, that's the ColdFusion developers themselves expanding their knowledge, and then taking that knowledge and bringing us tools that expand our knowledge, right? So that's another way of passing it on. And yes, MVC didn't originate in ColdFusion. OO didn't originate in ColdFusion. But implementing these patterns and these techniques are tried and true methods that have been proven in just about every language, right? So having those capabilities in ColdFusion, having the ecosystem that we have, which has been community driven, right? I mean, I laugh every time I go to a keynote for Adobe and they say, hey, we've got this great new thing that we're doing, right? So what was it in 2021? Well, we've made it so that you don't have to install 4 gigs of ColdFusion in order to get ColdFusion. And it's like, yeah, Lucy did that, 4 years ago, 5 years, whatever.
Well, that's why competition is great.
Exactly. And I think that the community has pushed Adobe to be absolutely.
And vice versa. I would say Adobe pushes Lucy to be on their toes too.
Absolutely. I agree.
So,
and I think that competition is what's brought on and spurred the innovations that we've had over the last 5 to 10 years in this industry, as far as ColdFusion goes.
And it's not backstabbing, cutthroat competition. It's
no.
Competition.
It is friendly competition. Absolutely.
And even with other languages, sometimes I know the Adobe folks were going to Java conferences, and I think the Altis folks do. You probably do.
Yep.
And other languages. There's many places to learn and share ideas, and also to spread the fact that ColdFusion is alive and kicking, and
it is
very
definitely.
Speaking of which, what would it take to make ColdFusion more alive this year?
It would take more developers taking the time to learn some of these techniques, I think. I'm still, unfortunately, I still do a lot of hiring for clients. And I'm still running into a lot of developers that have been doing ColdFusion for 20 years, but still haven't picked up on MVC or OO or any of these patterns that have been there for at least a decade, right? So I think that what would make the language more alive would be developers taking time to learn these patterns and to spread their love of ColdFusion to anyone who will listen. And that's what I've been doing this past several months, is spreading my love of ColdFusion to anyone that will listen. I think that, the whole ColdFusion is dead thing, if you're
ColdFusion is dead thing is dead, I would say.
Yeah, but if you're in the Java community, Java's dead. If you're in the PHP community, PHP is dead.
Ruby,
right?
Ruby on Rails
Ruby's has been dead for decades, right? So
I think in the next programming language that's launched, they should pre-dead it before
it's right. So this notion that a language,
maybe we can call the language dead.
Dead, yeah.
Yes, that will be the name of the language. It's dead ML. Yeah.
Right. I mean, to say any language is dead is really,
it's ridiculous.
Ridiculous, right? There's still
yes, there are less used languages, but even languages you might call somewhat dead, and for maybe somewhat valid reasons, like COBOL, Fortran, haven't seen. They don't get annual updates like ColdFusion does.
No,
but there's billions of lines of code written in those languages that's in use.
Yep.
And in the case of COBOL, it runs our whole banking system is run on COBOL, guys.
It is.
So maybe making fun of it perhaps isn't too smart. And in the case of Fortran, it's used widely by scientists for scientific modeling. And, I don't want to go off on a political tangent here, but there was some scientific modeling done in the last few years that turned out not to be too accurate, and they were doing it in Fortran code. So it wasn't the Fortran code that was the problem.
It was right.
It was the business logic that had the issue.
Yeah.
But the point I was trying to make is Fortran is still a useful language. There's lots of libraries out there for it. Of course, I'm probably slightly biased because I did learn Fortran when I had my first corporate job programming.
Right.
My first full-time job. I had summer jobs before that with other languages, but that paid job was using Fortran. So I have a bit of love for it. And, when I did a math degree, we used Fortran for all the, whatever the course was, numeric analysis, I guess we called it.
Yeah.
So, So use some of these new features. And I'm just going to give a challenge to everyone listening. What's one small baby step you could take in the next week to learn one of these languages? And, maybe you can find a video on it if you're into videos, or you can Google for stuff. Or the latest thing is use one, Chat GPT or some of these AIs, and you just ask it, well, give me a really simple summary of MVC and programming in ColdFusion, and it'll give you a lot of great information. And then you can quiz it, and if you don't understand something, you ask it to explain it to you. It's a quite world-changing technology. So I think you mentioned Into the Box, and you're planning, that's the next conference you're going to in 2024.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So I hope to be speaking there. I hope to be speaking there again, but if not, I'm going to go anyway. Frankly, I'm looking forward to seeing some of my old friends back in the DC metro area, because that's kind of my old stomping ground. But Into the Box has always been kind of an intimate setting, and everyone is always very approachable. All the speakers, especially, are very approachable. Even after they've done their presentation.
Absolutely.
So it's always felt like more like a family gathering to me than a a CF Summit, 400 people kind of conference. I2B's always been a little smaller. But the same
it's around 100, maybe
100,
yeah, something like that. So it's happening in Washington D.C. next year. They moved from Texas.
Yep.
So they're going to experiment with doing it in downtown Washington D.C. So all East Coast ColdFusion developers, you have no excuse now. You might have said, well, flying to Texas, well, that's like going to a foreign country.
Yeah.
And you might have been right, in fact, because the brisket barbecue in Texas is very special. But now you don't have an excuse. Flying to Washington, D.C. is super easy. It's right in downtown. You can take the metro from the airport to get there. And should be a great event. It's in April 2024. So, and if you're unable for whatever reason to attend the conference, they publish all the videos from the conference on their CFcast video channel, which is a great learning resource for ColdFusion. And you can pay to have online access to those. They have other non-into the box videos on there that you can get separately. It's sort of like a Netflix for ColdFusion. You've got to be careful because you can binge watch your way into
into trouble.
Yes, but you can search for topics like MVC or REST or microservice, whatever, and see all the videos on it. So, they have some free ones in there too. You don't have to pay money at the beginning, if you want to test it out. So, I was interviewing the guy who wrote that, Pete. But it's on his last name anyway. I'll put the link in the show notes for that episode. Well, great. Well, thanks for coming on the show. If people want to find you online, what are the best ways to reach out to you? Refactor.
I'm not really a big social media guy, so the best way to reach out to me is on LinkedIn. You can find me at Denny Springle IV out there, and then GitHub. It's just Denny Springle. You can find me there and look at my repos and the open source code that I've put out there over the years. That's pretty much the easiest way to get in touch with me these days. I have a Facebook, but I don't use it. I have a Twitter, but I just kind of don't use that either. I've never really been a big fan of
TikTok's off your radar then.
TikTok I don't even have. So yeah, you're right. TikTok is way off my radar. No Instagram. Wise. No Instagram either. So
no.
We'll put and no OnlyFans. I know everyone's going to be disappointed in that, but no OnlyFans.
We're very disappointed. I was looking for like some very exciting refactoring video on your OnlyFans.
Right.
Yeah, that would be an interesting concept.
Right.
Well, great. Well, thanks for coming on, Denny. We'll put those links in the show notes at terratech.com. And I look forward to seeing you again at some future event or on the show.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Get detailed show notes on today's episode in your free CF Alive Modern ColdFusion Guide at terratech.com. That is TERATECH.com. Viva la CF Alive Revolution!